Is America's blood supply tainted with deadly mRNA poisoning? Well, it sure seems that way. New research from Kevin McKernan and Dr. Peter McCullough, friend of the show, Dr. McCullough, shows that mRNA can linger in the body years after vaccination, yet our nation's blood banks still refuse to actually track whether a donor has had the shot in the first place. Families are now coming forward with other stories of severe injuries after transfusions. They didn't even get the shot. While more than 1 in 5 Americans say, yep, this fall, they're definitely going to take the COVID shots this fall. I was just at the airport and I couldn't believe how many people I was seeing with masks on again. What is going on here? At least 11 states are pushing blood freedom bills to protect the right to non-mRNA donor blood, but federal regulators aren't budging on this at all. So this is no longer just a medical question. It's about transparency. It's about choice. And it's about whether we can trust what's flowing through our hospitals right now. Who will step in? Well, one person is stepping in, trying to make us all aware of this. That is the Vice President of Safe Blood, Dr. Clayton Morris, joins us now. Doc, great to see you, and thank you for the work that you're doing at Safe Blood. Thank you for being here on the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, we've been tracking this story for a couple of years. Friend of the show, Thomas Havland, who, of course, has been really out there on the ramparts teaching us all about the white fibrous clots that have been showing up on autopsy tables, both in obviously dead patients, but alive patients as well. And we first started discussing this on the show maybe a year and a half ago about America's blood supply, about America's tainted blood supply. And really doesn't seem to be any markers or tests in place to tell us whether or not we're getting safe blood. How did you first come to really take up this flag and really start to educate all of us about this?
Well, this is very interesting. So Safe Blood got started in Switzerland when European doctors there were looking at blood under magnification right after the rollout of the vaccine. So this was around August of 20, and our founder, George Della Pietra, was among them. And what they were seeing in the blood was clear disturbances, anomalies that they hadn't seen except in, people with advanced disease. And these were often people just walking around asymptomatic. So they knew that the mRNA shots were affecting the blood badly. And the assumption at that time was, well, it means transfusions are going to be potentially unsafe. So Safe Blood was started. And of course, those deductions from the empirical evidence were rapidly borne out. And you mentioned Tom Haviland and his work looking at the coroner's reports. Those were one of the first signs. It was the coroners who were saying, we're seeing these blood clots, these strange, long fibrinous clots that are not only happening in the vaccinated, but in some unusual cases, we're seeing with people who weren't vaccinated, but did prior to that have a blood transfusion for surgery. So that was really the first telltale sign that was reported to us, and then more just began rolling in. I mean, famously, baby Matthew in Washington State received a blood transfusion in the first few days of his life, and ultimately died from a clot that ran from the knee to the heart. From one of those very clots. Let me correct myself. I don't know if he got the transfusion in the first few days, but he was a newborn and he died shortly, really after birth, because they had to do a congenital heart surgery on him that should have a 95% chance of success. And during a preliminary surgery, they gave him blood off the shelf, and that proved to be deadly.
I mean, from a medical, that's awful.
Yeah, it is.
Think about how devastating that is for a family to begin with, thinking that maybe you're in the clear. Were they able to pinpoint specifically that this came from contaminated blood?
Well, it really only could have, because they had arranged for blood for the main procedure to be, from what we call directed donation. And that's what Safe Blood does. We weren't involved in this case, but we match donors with recipients peer-to-peer, person-to-person, so that someone can get blood from someone they know has not received a mRNA vaccine. Now, in the case of baby Alex, that blood came off the shelf during a preliminary surgery when the doctor just decided to top up the infant's levels. how do we know? This is one of these cases we really need more studies and more testing, like you spoke of. We can deduce that it was because that blood would have had a 70 to 80% chance of being from vaccinated donors, especially at that time, recently after the rollout. And then it had the very effect that we only see from people who had received the vaccine. So it was as smoking a gun as you're going to get.
From a medical standpoint, I mean, this is one case, of course, but what are the potential risks to patients who receive blood from vaccinated donors who they themselves have, they went to great lengths to not get this shot? They saw all of the adverse effects. They were reading the data. They were listening to Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Pierre Corey, Robert Malone, et cetera. They were saying, absolutely not, I don't want this in my body. So what are the potential risks to patients who get it inadvertently and they don't realize they're getting it?
Well, I mean, that's the tragedy because people did avoid it and then they couldn't avoid it because they needed this blood for a transfusion. And what we're seeing is really all of the same adverse reactions to the mRNA vaccines that are being reported in VAERS. Those are the things that we're seeing in patients who received blood and, got blood that was unsafe for them. And that's everything from things like Bell's palsy to, Correlia Corral, who we have her story on our website. She was 26 days in the hospital with pericarditis, around the heart. Her pericardial sac had to be drained of clots. All the way to, Bill Hynek, another story. He had multiple adverse reactions, had clotting in his veins so strong that his wife says when they'd go to draw blood, they sometimes couldn't draw it because of the clotting. And he ultimately died. I mean, just a number of stories, so many that we are working on a study on this to really bring it into the scientific medical literature. I'm working with James Thorpe on authoring that. But to answer your question, yeah, it's the whole range of these adverse reactions that we've seen of the mRNA vaccine, up to and including death, and specifically things that we see from those and not as any sort of typical transfusion risk. We had a case in the Netherlands of a woman who was trying to get blood from unvaccinated donors. And there, it's much harder in Europe. We still have much greater freedoms in the United States, which is why things like these bills and the legislation you referred to are so important. But this woman in the Netherlands, she tried to get blood and they told her, no, the blood is safe. The vaccine was safe and effective, nothing to worry about. She ended up dying she had embolisms in the leg and in the lungs. So clotting in the lung and legs that she died from. And the doctor who did the report, the hematologist, who 20 years in the field, pointed out this is not a blood transfusion reaction. This isn't seen before in blood transfusions. So
I was going to ask
these
you,
are ways
are
that we
these,
know.
yeah, these are not common. So when you talked about like myocarditis or pericarditis or these things, is that common at all in normal transfusions?
To my knowledge, no. Yeah. It's not. And that's why these are standing out because, I mean, it's not that people tend to think of transfusions as being completely risk-free, and they're not. But and of course, there are risks of other, say, things like remember the AIDS epidemic and the issue there in the 80s, which was such a foreshadowing of what we're seeing now, where doctors who were on top of the science and reasoning correctly said, hey, there should be problems for transfusion recipients. And Dr. Marty McCary has written an excellent book on this called Blood, and his chapter on what went on with AIDS and blood transfusions reads like, it literally reads like a prophecy of today, where the doctors who were on top of it sent out warnings, they were chastised or disciplined, and it took about 7 years for the problem to get rectified by the blood banks and the federal government. And in that time, lots of people died, including virtually a whole generation of hemophiliacs, right? And so this is why safe blood exists. We know there's going to be this period between the problem being identified and the establishment finally admitting, after being forced to, that there's a real problem. We need to take real results. And we don't want people to be harmed by this in the meantime. We really want them to have the opportunity to get blood that's safe.
Why are the blood banks really refusing to track the mRNA status of donors? It seems like this would be I mean, is it political pressure? Is it something from big pharma that's trying to keep? We see President Trump is now moving forward with an investigation in Operation Warp Speed. It seems like he's finally open to the idea that he was bamboozled. He wants to understand why he was lied to by Pfizer and Moderna and these other big pharma companies and hiding information from him. And this is a big moment. A lot of people who are like in the MAGA movement really felt like this was out of step. Like, Mr. President, why are you supporting Operation Warp Speed? I mean, look at the potentially millions of people that were affected as a result of this horrible rollout. So why do you think the blood banks and maybe the American Red Cross and others are refusing to track the mRNA status of donors?
Well, I think there's an array of reasons that all come together to the same end, right? Now, one of them is it's in the 80s, for example. One reason they wanted to keep this hush-hush about the dangers of AIDS for blood transfusions is they didn't want to panic regarding the blood supply. Like, they were more afraid of a panic in general of the public not wanting to receive blood than they were about the potential victims from bad blood. That is probably a big explanation here. I think also, blood is a business, right, for the blood banks. We think of them as kind of like philanthropies, but they're selling that blood to secondary markets for things like Botox and other biological products. And so they have a lot of money at stake. And, I think of it like those cars that blew up in the 80s, right? If only a few of them are blowing up, still every one of that make has to be recalled, right? Everything is suspect. And so, and this is the case where it's not just, a few, it could be a lot more that are blowing up. And so I think they have every reason and every motivation to avoid the evidence that this actually is a problem for them. I think that drives
this seems like war to me. I mean, maybe just because I'm a history major, I draw so many connections to like war, but I think about like the Vietnam War, like the refusal to admit what an absolute disaster and mistake it is, or Afghanistan. So we just got to keep going. We just keep going. We just cannot actually admit that potentially millions of people have been affected or killed as a result of this. We just got to keep going to save face. And now they're doubling down during NFL games. You're going to see Travis Kelce doing commercials where I'm going to get the flu shot and the COVID shot. You can go on the same day and get both of them. And they're going to be pushing right as we head into the fall. They're doubling down on it again, Doc.
Yeah, well, I think your analogy to say like the Vietnam War is so apropos because there we were drawn in, right, by a false flag, by a basically
Bingo.
theater to draw everybody in. And then there's really criminality involved, right? Pfizer, when they tried to hide the evidence of how damaging this vaccine was for 75 years, and they did so with the collusion of the FDA. So,
right.
Ed Dowd made a great point about people like, these big financial tycoons that get caught in a Ponzi scheme, right? They don't say at the end, okay, you got me. They don't confess in court and say finally, okay, I admit I did it. They go all the way to jail claiming their innocence, even though they absolutely know that it was a scheme. And that's what's going on here. The guilty parties are not going to come out and say, yeah, you're right. We pulled off a fraud that killed millions of people, right? They're going to go to their grave claiming that they were innocent. And it's up to us to discern the truth and to get to that truth as quickly as we can, because we don't want other people to be harmed by this.
I mean, we're seeing legislation now in at least 11 states for blood freedom. What do these bills actually propose, and how much pushback are they facing? And if they are facing pushback, where is it coming from?
Well, the pushback does come from the blood banks. So I testified before the legislature in Wyoming, and the main blood bank there was against the legislation designed simply to keep a freedom that's widely accepted available, right? Because there are concerns. What's happening in some states, particularly the Pacific Northwest, is that it's not a state policy, but hospitals and blood providers will just stop allowing people to get what's called directed donations, or they'll make it very difficult. And directed donation is where we say, let's say you and I are matching blood type. You say, look, I trust Clinton Ohlers. I think he has a pretty clean lifestyle, and he's offered to donate blood for me. So I'd rather have his blood than just blood off the shelf. That was very common. My wife's aunt had pancreatic cancer, and she did that. There was no controversy before COVID happened or before the vaccine rolled out. Yet suddenly, in certain states, it's becoming increasingly difficult. Now in Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, in Ohio, the American Red Cross there has made it more difficult to get these directed donations. So what's happening is people are saying, wait, this is a totally just a given health freedom. This is a civil rights issue. We should be able to get the blood that we feel comfortable with, regardless of whether or not it's an issue. And so, you should just be able to do that for your own peace of mind. And so now they're having to put forward legislation. And the opposition, though, does come from the blood banks. And so there I understood that I wasn't surprised, let's say, by the fact that the major blood bank in Wyoming was against this. And I spoke with their representative off the phone privately and said, look, isn't there some agreement we could have? Like we're customers of you, basically. Like this doesn't need to be a bad thing. And they just, weren't having it. But then what was fascinating was that the American Red Cross showed up to testify. So they sent a hematologist to come in and testify against this bill in Wyoming, and the Red Cross doesn't operate in Wyoming. So they didn't have a financial interest there. And so the opposition, we can continue to elaborate on why that happens, but we know that they do. And what's really disheartening is when you see people that use their higher degrees, like I have a PhD, you see these MDs come in who are hematologists, and they're quoting studies that are from like the 1980s. The information they're trying to give legislators is outdated. It's anywhere between false to misleading, right? And they have to know that it is. I mean, I have to believe that they know that it is. I don't know how they can't. And so it's very discouraging to see people using the credibility that they gain with an MD in order to, protect a financial self-interest at the potential harm in other people.
Do you think informed consent is being violated when these people are not told whether their transfusion came from an mRNA vaccinated donor?
Absolutely. I spent last week working on legislation that is going to be introduced in Florida, and that is the focus that we're taking, is that this is an informed consent issue. And we're really even focusing on the spike protein. We need testing to understand how much spike protein might be in a unit of blood, right? People should know, is there spike protein? Because everybody agrees that spike protein is bad. You don't want spike protein in your blood, right? That's regardless of where you fall on whether the vaccine was dangerous or not, right? So this is something we can all agree on. And we're saying as an issue of informed consent, people need to know the origins of this blood, the donor status, and as testing becomes available, blood should be tested to know if it contains these harmful components.
What role should the FDA play in all of this?
Well, I believe that our national, organizations, that HSS needs to get on board, right? And I think they will. Under Kennedy, I mean, there's so many good things happening. But I think they've been in the position of they've been the bad guy, right? I mean, they were out there suppressing ivermectin. They were suppressing things that we know were stopping the spread of COVID. They were suppressing those at the very time that they could have helped people. So there has to be a real change going on at the FDA where they come out of the pocket of Big Pharma and these other interests and get into protecting the American people. And as they do that, and I think they will, because I also know that there are a lot of doctors there and a lot of scientists at these organizations like the FDA and the CDC who have felt held hostage or have had to leave because speaking the truth they're going to get canceled like anyone else, or they did get canceled. And so people, express some skepticism about RFK Jr. as perhaps in some way, hindering the FDA and the CDC and these organizations, but it's absolutely the opposite, right? What he's doing is he's freeing the good people there to not be punished for speaking the truth, and that'll have good results.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about RFK. How do you think, is he well informed on this particular issue? And what's been the communication maybe with your team at Safe Blood and others who have been raising the alarm bell about maybe the lawsuits,
Yeah.
just the blood supply in general?
That is a great question. I believe that he is informed regarding this, and I think it's one of these things that is a perhaps a secondary issue. It's a primary issue if you need blood, right? But in terms of the priorities that they had in their first 100 days and now in the subsequent period, like look how long it's taken to get the machinery moving to bring about the kinds of warnings that were needed on the mRNA vaccines. So many people were concerned at first saying, why aren't these just being pulled off the market? But it's not that easy to do because not everybody agrees, right? You still have a lot of medical doctors who think this was safe and effective. And I actually think there's a corollary problem here, which is it was medical doctors who were the first ones to sound the alarms. But why has so much of medical science been completely bamboozled? Why are they not waking up and smelling the coffee? I mean, that is a huge, my background is intellectual history focused on history of science. And this fascinates me because this is a huge, I think, social problem when you have networks of trust and false information that are masquerading as true science. And the larger part of your scientific establishment is the last to wake up and smell the coffee. That's an enormous social problem. But given that that's the case, RFK Jr. has to move strategically to change the direction of the ship. And it was really Del Bigtree who persuaded me on that. I was getting a little bit jaded, saying, when is this going to happen? And Bigtree came out and said, look, we're not going for a quick victory that's going to end up being, just a Pyrrhic victory. We're going for, RFK Jr. is going for the big win, and that's going to take time to get that ball really into the end zone.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of swamp monsters and entrenched people who are actively fighting against this. You just saw that with the CDC protests and everything else. So I agree with you on that. With polls, I mentioned the poll kind of at the top that 1 in 5 Americans say they're going to get this COVID vaccine. Just terrifying to me. I can't believe that this is still happening. But I mean, 1 in 5 admit that this fall they're going to get a COVID vaccine. That's crazy to me. How urgent does it make this issue then on the blood supply?
Well, to me, obviously, it makes it very urgent. I think it does to everyone because I had been very encouraged when, say, there was only like 2 or 3% uptake of the booster. And I was very hopeful that what was going on here was something that maybe might affect us for 5 years or more, where there was this assault to the health of the global population by way of these mRNA vaccines. But as people stopped doing it, maybe people's bodies would right themselves. The problem is that once you've fooled a certain percentage, once you've fooled a large portion of the population, there's going to be a certain percentage that are just not going to want to admit they were wrong or going to be completely bought in. And it looks like perhaps that percentage is 20%. And that means then that the blood supply will continue to be unsafe. Now, we also have these other indicators, which you mentioned right at the beginning, Kevin McKernan's studies, Peter McCullough. I mean, McCullough, they're finding mRNA in the body. This was supposed to break down in hours to days, right? They've got a patient with mRNA in his system verified 3.2 years after his last injection. So as McCullough put it, he said, this is not now a short-term problem. This is something that's going to be with us, 10 to 15 years, and I would say at least. And so this is really all the more reason people want to protect themselves in every way that they can, because we don't know when we're going to be out of the woods, and it's going to take a lot of, let's say we get totally out of the woods. I mean, that would be fantastic. That would be a win for us. Safe Blood would celebrate, right? But we're not out of the woods until we have the testing and the research in place to know we're out of the woods. And that's going to take time.
So that leads me really to the thought that we're in a sort of a worst case. I mean, what is really the worst case scenario here for America's blood supply over the next few years? Because we are not out of the woods. And what solutions, do you believe are necessary right now as of this fall, 2025?
Well, absolutely. People who have surgeries that they know they're going to have, right? They need to be matched up with a donor that is not mRNA recipient. Okay. do that through Safe Blood. If you don't have somebody that you know and want to arrange that personally, which is, a good deal of work, that's what we exist for. We have members all over the country. We're in 55 countries, and we have members in every state who have stepped up to say, I am happy to, for no remuneration, to give my blood to help people who need it. Okay. And so we have donors that are waiting for you. So if you have a planned surgery, don't wait. You can go to our site, safeblood.com. You can become a member, a monthly member for, a low fee. We do, for people who really want to get behind the movement, they can become lifetime members. But this is something that we're happy to do. In fact, we'd be happy to give a 10% code, for your listeners who'd like it. I don't know if you'd like to do that. Say, we could use the Clayton as the code.
Yeah, let's use the code Clayton. Yeah, let's use the code Clayton. I was going to say redacted, but let's use the code Clayton. Okay. You guys get 10% off. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then for people who do monthly, that will erase the initial monthly fee. So you just go straight to month payments. So that's a savings, because we want to get many people involved. I should also add that if you're a service member who was wrongfully terminated because you avoided the vaccine, we do not want to see you be in a situation where you can't get the blood that you need. So those memberships are free. So for anyone who's in the service, please contact us. Now, at a larger level, here's something else too that's really important. And James Thorpe always asks me to mention this. Women who are pregnant. The big problem right now is that we can get you blood for a planned surgery. But what about emergencies? Right? I tell people I drive very carefully, because in emergency, there's nothing in place yet to make bona fide non-mRNA blood available in emergencies. So you just have to take what's off the shelf if you really need it. And pregnancy is a case where a woman can anticipate that there might be a need for blood. I mean, look at Nicole Shanahan, right? Now I think her case was a miscarriage, but women do sometimes need to go into surgery during a delivery. So you could do what's called autologous donations, which is where you donate to yourself, right? And a woman can donate a unit to herself, up to about 30 or 40 days ahead of time, and then have at least some on hand in case she were to have bleeding. That's a great thing to do. And the American Red Cross supports that and allows it, and we're very appreciative to them for that. Now, for this bigger issue of what happens if you're in a car accident and you need blood, well, there we really have to move at the state level and at the national level. We need the blood banks tracking the donor status of the blood so that there can be, as you brought up, informed consent. And as testing comes online, we need testing, and that will at least, and we need that reserved for emergency cases, so that if somebody has an emergency, there's non-mRNA blood on hand, so that they at least are able to request it. Because look, what groups are at risk? If you haven't had the vaccine, you're at risk, right? Because you don't know whether you might have an especially strong reaction. Now, there is questions of, is it just the lots? Were some lots more destructive than others? So what it is, but we don't totally know. Some people are obviously more susceptible than others, and you don't know who you are. And if you've avoided the vaccine, you don't want to find that out. But what about people, like I have a good friend, he got transverse myelitis right after getting the shot in December, right? This was just this December. He got the COVID-19 vaccine, he got transverse, he was paralyzed for 2 weeks. He never knew if he'd walk again. And so if he needs a blood transfusion, he does not want to take the risk of further exposure. So it's really important. That's something Safe Blood really focuses on. We want to see anybody who needs blood get it. This isn't just for a matching system for unvaccinated people to give to other unvaccinated people. This is unvaccinated people really trying to minister to the whole population, anyone who needs blood, especially if you've had the shot and had an adverse reaction. Don't expose yourself again.
Right. Yeah, it's deeply troubling. I hope that the administration is paying attention to this and we can get this sorted out at the federal level. And it's good to know at least 11 states are moving forward on this level. And it's good to know that folks like you at Safe Blood are taking this seriously, and there's a place for people to turn. So safeblood.com. Again, Doc, you just mentioned the code Clayton, so we'll throw that in there. So I guess people can get 10% off in there as well. Really appreciate it. My guest has been Dr. Clayton Ohlers. Thank you so much for the work that you guys are doing, you and Thomas and everyone else who's trying to bring awareness to this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.